This morning, Donald Trump now has a trial date in the New York City hush money case he'd long fought to see delayed or dismissed outright.
This is election interference. That's all it is. Election interference. And it's a disgrace.
The judge setting an April 15th trial date for Mr. Trump in what would be the first criminal trial of a former president in history. The presumptive GOP nominee lashing out, baselessly blaming President Biden for his New York State prosecution on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to alleged hush money payments to porn star Stormy Daniels.
I don't know how you can have a trial like this in the middle of an election, a presidential election. And this is a Biden trial. These are all Biden trials.
But even as Mr. Trump sat stone-faced in a Manhattan courtroom, a New York appeals court judge was handing him a victory in another case. The appeals court cutting the bond owed by the former president by more than half to $175 million as he appeals the nearly $500 million civil fraud judgment against him.
All right, guys, Dr. John here. So what just happened, guys? Forbes and the financial press have been quietly documenting it, and the courts have been cementing it. Trump's financial empire, built over half a century, is collapsing simultaneously on every front. Court judgments, market reality, and decades of financial deception have all converged at once. And what once seemed immune to economic gravity is now in synchronized freefall.
Respect the appellate division for substantially reducing that ridiculous amount of money.
Mr. Trump saying he'll have the cash within the new 10-day deadline imposed.
Hey, now that the bond's been reduced, are you going to start putting money into your campaign?
Yeah.
You haven't done that since 2016.
Well, first of all, it's none of your business, frankly. But I might do that.
The Trump campaign using the appeals court ruling to fundraise for both their political and legal accounts, texting supporters, quote, huge victory, but now is not the time to celebrate.
You know, it raises a good question, Garrett. If somebody's donating to the Trump campaign, is he able to use that directly for his legal bills or the bond obligation, or do you have to donate through a specific super PAC or legal defense fund if you want to help the legal defense?
No, Savannah, if you click the link in that text message, 10 cents of every dollar you give to Donald Trump goes to a fund that has been used to pay for his legal bills up to this point. He has not used any of that money to pay his bond judgment or any of the civil penalties against him. It's not clear at all that he could legally, but the political and the legal have always been so intermixed with Donald Trump, but when it comes to basic things like campaign fundraising, they very much are here.
Let us begin with the stock, because the stock tells the story of the gap between the mythology of Trump's business genius and the cold, hard reality of his actual commercial track record. Trump Media and Technology Group, the parent company of Truth Social, went public through a special purpose acquisition merger that catapulted the company onto the public markets with a valuation that defied every conventional measure of business fundamentals.
Now, some breaking news coming out of the US, and it's about Donald Trump. He posted a $91.6 million bond as he appeals a judgment against him in a defamation case brought by the writer Jean Carroll. Well, let's go live now and speak to our North America correspondent, Neda Taufik. Neda, tell us more.
Yeah, well, Miriam, as you said, this is a matter in the Jean Carroll case. That's the writer who accused Donald Trump of raping her in the 90s. And while Donald Trump has always denied those allegations, a jury did order him to pay her $83.3 million in January, saying that he had defamed her when he was president by calling her a liar. Now, in order to appeal that verdict, Donald Trump had to put up a bond, 110% of that award value with the court. So he has done that today. There was always many questions around Donald Trump's financing. He has said he has plenty of money.
At its peak, the man's personal stake in this enterprise was briefly valued at an astronomical sum that exceeded $4 billion on paper. The retail investors who piled into the stock, driven by loyalty, by speculation, by the hope that this was their chance to own a piece of the Trump brand, pushed the price to heights that bore no relationship to the underlying performance of the company.
To fight his legal battles and to pay the awards. So today he has put with the court $91.6 million. That will be held with the court. That won't go to Jean Carroll yet. That will be pending the outcome of his appeal. He'll get that money back. If he wins on appeal, E. Jean Carroll will get that money if he fails in his appeal. And Miriam, this is really just the start of Donald Trump having to pay massive amounts of money. In this case, he had tried to delay paying that bond and the execution of the judgment. The judge had denied that, so he paid this bond just ahead of a deadline on Monday. But he has another deadline approaching in another case, the civil fraud case, where he was ordered by New York State to pay over $400 million. So again, in order to appeal that case, he's going to have to put up a lot of money. He asked a judge, a separate judge, to just put forward $100 million, but that was denied. So another key deadline coming for Donald Trump.
The revenue was negligible. The user base of the platform was a tiny fraction of the audiences commanded by mainstream social media networks. The advertising dollars were not flowing in at rates that would justify a multi-billion-dollar market capitalization. The business model was essentially a single, relatively small platform with a passionate but limited audience, and the financial statements showed quarter after quarter of losses. The market, as markets inevitably do, eventually began to reconcile the hype with the reality. The stock price started its long, grinding descent from those stratospheric highs. Insider selling restrictions expired and selling pressure intensified. The initial enthusiasm that had papered over the weak fundamentals began to evaporate. The result, as documented by Forbes and corroborated by independent financial analysis, is a decline so steep that it has erased more than $1 billion from Trump's estimated net worth. $1 billion with a capital letter that represents not theoretical losses on some distant balance sheet, but the actual vaporization of wealth that had been assigned to his name in the public record. This is the largest single hit to his net worth that has been documented and traced to a specific identifiable asset. The pattern is clear and it is damning. The stock was valued based on his political persona, not on the economic viability of the business. When the enthusiasm faded, so did the wealth. The stock collapse alone would be a devastating financial blow, but it is merely one front in a multi-front war against the solvency and viability of the empire. The most conventional weapon being deployed against the Trump organization is the civil fraud judgment handed down by the New York courts, a ruling that gets to the very core of how the entire business was constructed and maintained over decades. This was not a case about a single transaction or a minor accounting error. This was a sweeping judicial finding that Donald Trump and his organization engaged in persistent, repeated, and systematic fraud, submitting financial statements that wildly inflated the value of his properties to secure favorable loan terms, lower insurance premiums, and a public image of wealth and success that was, in many respects, a carefully constructed illusion. The judge looked at the evidence, the actual square footage of the apartments, the actual zoning restrictions on the estates, the actual market comparisons for the properties, and concluded that the numbers Trump had been presenting to banks and insurers were not aggressive estimates or optimistic projections. They were fraudulent. The price tag attached to this judicial finding was staggering. The initial judgment came in at a figure approaching $464 million. But that number is not static. New York law applies a statutory interest rate of 9% on civil judgments, and that interest accrues with every passing day, compounding the liability into a sum that grows larger the longer the appeals process drags on. By the time the calendar flips through the months of litigation and appeal, the total exposure on this single judgment will have swelled to an amount approaching $700 million. Let that number sit with you for a moment. $700 million owed to the state of New York, accruing interest, with no easy escape hatch. Trump attempted to secure a bond to cover the judgment while the appeals process plays out, standard practice for any defendant who wants to prevent immediate enforcement. But the bond required was massive, and the surety companies that usually provide such financial instruments were not willing to write a check for the full amount. The man who has spent decades claiming to be a billionaire with vast liquid resources was unable to convince the standard bond providers that he had the financial capacity to backstop a bond of that size. The appeals court eventually allowed a reduced bond of $175 million, a fraction of the total liability, to be posted while the case works its way through the system. The reduction itself was a quiet admission that the publicly proclaimed wealth did not match the documented financial reality. The New York Attorney General, having secured the judgment, did not simply sit back and wait for the appeals to conclude. She began the process of filing the judgment as liens against the specific properties that form the crown jewels of the Trump real estate portfolio. This is a legal step that attaches the debt to the physical assets, ensuring that the properties cannot be sold, refinanced, or transferred without addressing the judgment. These lien filings are not symbolic gestures. They are legal encumbrances that cloud the title of every affected property and make it extraordinarily difficult to use those properties as collateral for new loans or to extract equity from them. The filings were made in the counties where the marquee properties are located, creating a legal dragnet that ensnares the most iconic buildings and estates in the portfolio. The specific properties now encumbered by these lien filings read like a tour of the Trump brand's greatest hits. In Manhattan, the liens attached to Trump Tower, the gilt-covered Fifth Avenue skyscraper where the political career was launched on that famous escalator ride. They attached to 40 Wall Street, the towering financial district property held under a long-term ground lease that has been struggling with its own financial difficulties for years. They attach to Trump Park Avenue, the luxury residential building that generates rental income. Beyond the city, the liens reach into Westchester County, where the sprawling Seven Springs estate sits on over 200 acres of rolling hills, a property whose valuation was specifically called out in the fraud judgment because Trump had claimed it was worth hundreds of millions based on development potential that local zoning laws did not actually permit. The liens also reach into Nassau County on Long Island, where the Trump National Golf Club operates, generating revenue from memberships and events. Each of these properties now carries a legal burden that complicates every aspect of its financial management. The Seven Springs estate deserves particular attention because it illustrates the specific nature of the fraud that was found. Trump had valued this property based on the assumption that he could subdivide it and build a large number of residential homes, turning a single estate into a lucrative development project. The problem was that Westchester County zoning regulations did not allow for the kind of high-density development that Trump was claiming as the basis for his valuation. He was presenting financial statements to lenders that assigned a value to the property based on a hypothetical future that was legally impossible. The court looked at this and concluded that it was not a mistake or a difference of opinion. It was fraud. The property's actual market value was a fraction of the number Trump had been using, and the judgment includes penalties specifically tied to this property. The lien filing in Westchester County means that Seven Springs, a property Trump has owned since the 1990s and has used as a weekend retreat and a site for hosting events, is now directly in the crosshairs of the judgment enforcement process. The Florida situation adds another layer of complexity and vulnerability. Trump has established his primary residence at Mar-a-Lago, the Palm Beach estate that serves as his winter White House and the center of his social and political operations in the Sunshine State. Florida's homestead protection laws are among the strongest in the nation, shielding a primary residence from most forms of judgment enforcement by creditors. These protections are designed to prevent families from losing their homes to debt collectors. But the New York judgment is not a typical creditor claim. It is a civil fraud judgment from another state, and the interaction between Florida homestead law and out-of-state fraud findings creates a legal battleground that has not been fully tested. The New York Attorney General's office has been working through the legal mechanisms to enforce the judgment against Florida assets despite the homestead shield, arguing that fraud judgments should not be so easily evaded by a change of residency. The fight over Mar-a-Lago is technical, it is ongoing, and it represents an existential threat to the property that Trump has called home and used as the backdrop for countless public appearances. The possibility that Mar-a-Lago could be seized or forced into a sale is a scenario that has caused genuine panic in his orbit. Beyond Mar-a-Lago, the Florida portfolio includes Trump National Doral, the massive golf resort that is one of the largest revenue-generating properties in the entire organization. Doral is not just a golf course. It is a sprawling complex with multiple courses, a hotel, conference facilities, and a steady stream of events and guests. This property is not protected by the homestead exemption because it is not a primary residence. It is a commercial enterprise. If the judgment enforcement moves forward in Florida, Doral is a prime target. The Jupiter Golf Resort, another Florida holding, adds to the list of properties that could be at risk. The strategy of enforcement is to put pressure on the assets that generate cash flow, making it increasingly difficult for the organization to operate normally while the legal liabilities hang over its head. The parallel track of the E. Jean Carroll case adds yet another dimension of financial exposure that compounds the pressure. Carroll secured 2 jury verdicts against Trump, one finding him liable for sexual abuse and defamation, the second imposing a massive punitive damages award for his continued defamation of her after the first verdict. The combined total of these verdicts exceeded $88 million. To appeal these verdicts, Trump was required to post a bond covering the judgment plus interest, a bond that currently sits in escrow at over $91 million, pending the Supreme Court's decision on whether to hear his final appeal. This money is locked up, inaccessible, and at risk of being transferred to Carroll the moment the Supreme Court denies review. The legal filings in this case have been extensive. The America First legal organization and Stephen Miller filed a brief supporting Trump's position, arguing that the verdicts were improper. Carroll's legal team, led by Roberta Kaplan, filed their opposition brief, arguing that the jury verdicts were sound and that the Supreme Court should not intervene. The case has been distributed and redistributed for conference, a procedural step that signals the justices are actively considering whether to take it up. If they deny review, the bond money goes to Carroll and Trump loses over $91 million in a single stroke. If they grant review, the litigation continues, but the money remains encumbered and out of his control either way. The cumulative financial pressure from these judgments, the liens, the stock collapse, and the legal expenses of fighting on multiple fronts is producing a secondary effect that may be even more damaging in the long run than the judgments themselves. Banks, insurance companies, and institutional investors are backing away from Trump-related transactions. Some lenders who have existing relationships with the organization are calling in loans, demanding repayment rather than extending or refinancing. Others are simply refusing to extend new credit, cutting off the flow of borrowed capital that has fueled the empire's expansion for decades. Insurance companies are tightening their terms, demanding higher premiums, or refusing to underwrite policies on Trump-branded properties. The due diligence calculations that every financial institution must perform now include the documented findings of fraud, the reputational risk of being associated with a convicted fraudster, and the legal uncertainty of doing business with an entity that is fighting multi-hundred-million-dollar judgments on multiple fronts. The business model that built the empire was based on aggressive leverage, borrowing heavily against properties that were valued at inflated numbers to secure favorable terms. That model is now broken. The inflated valuations have been judicially discredited. The leverage is becoming unsustainable. The refinancing options are shrinking. The admission from inside the White House that the Department of Justice was being used for personal retribution against political enemies adds another layer of toxicity to the environment. The Chief of Staff reportedly told a reporter that the prosecution of the New York Attorney General was the one retribution Trump wanted, a statement that documents the weaponization of federal law enforcement for personal vengeance against the very prosecutor who is now enforcing the civil fraud judgment. This is not just bad optics. It creates additional legal risk for anyone doing business with the Trump organization because it demonstrates a pattern of using governmental power to punish adversaries, a pattern that could easily extend to banks, insurers, or business partners who are perceived as insufficiently loyal. The institutional pullback from Trump transactions is not just about the fraud judgment or the court cases. It is about the total environment of legal and political risk that now surrounds any financial relationship with the organization. The practical implications for the properties themselves are becoming more concrete by the day. Trump Tower, the building that has been the symbol of the brand for decades, is operating in a Manhattan commercial real estate market that has been struggling since the pandemic upended office occupancy patterns. The office tenants in the building have reportedly declined, reducing rental income at a time when legal pressure on the property is increasing. 40 Wall Street, the financial district tower, has been a problem child for years, with debt service consuming significant cash flow and tenant occupancy trending downward. The lien filing makes it exceedingly difficult to refinance the debt on this property, potentially forcing it into a situation where the debt exceeds the equity and the lender moves to foreclose. Trump Park Avenue, the luxury residential building, faces similar pressures. The cumulative effect across the Manhattan portfolio is a financial vice that tightens with every passing month. The human element of this collapse is impossible to ignore. The employees of the Trump organization, The people who manage the hotels, maintain the golf courses, and operate the day-to-day business are facing an uncertain future. If properties are seized, sold, or forced into bankruptcy, the jobs that depend on those properties are at risk. The vendors who provide services to the organization, the caterers, the landscapers, the maintenance contractors, are all exposed to the financial instability of their client. The empire's contraction is not an abstract financial phenomenon. It is a process that affects real people and real communities. The man at the center of it, who has built his identity around the image of the successful billionaire dealmaker, is watching the assets that defined his public persona become the instruments of his financial undoing. There is a fairness that must be acknowledged in evaluating this situation. The defenders of Trump will argue, and they are not entirely wrong, that real estate valuations are inherently subjective and that different appraisers can reach different conclusions about what a property is worth. They will argue that the banks that lent money to Trump were sophisticated institutions that performed their own due diligence and were repaid in full, so where is the harm? They will argue that the New York Attorney General campaigned on a promise to prosecute Trump, and therefore the entire case is politically motivated. They will argue that the stock market decline of Trump media reflects broader market dynamics, and that many spacey companies have seen similar declines. These arguments have some surface plausibility, and they deserve to be heard. But the judicial findings in the fraud case were not based on minor differences of opinion between appraisers. They were based on specific, documented misrepresentations that cannot be dismissed as subjective. The Trump Tower triplex was listed on financial statements as having over 30,000 square feet, when the actual square footage was approximately 11,000. That is not a difference of opinion about market value. That is a false statement of physical fact. The Seven Springs valuation was based on development that zoning laws prohibited. That is not an optimistic projection. That is a claim of value based on a legal impossibility. The Mar-a-Lago valuation was rejected by the trial court after extensive expert testimony from both sides, and the judge found that the number Trump used was not supported by any credible market analysis. The banks may have been repaid, but the fraud judgment is about the benefit Trump received from the fraud, the lower interest rates, the better terms, the financial advantages that came from presenting a picture of wealth that was not real. The stock collapse of Trump media is not just about general market dynamics, it is about the gap between the company's business fundamentals and the valuation it achieved, a gap that was always going to close once the initial enthusiasm faded. The bottom line is that the empire is contracting. The stock has collapsed by over $1 billion. The fraud judgment with accruing interest is approaching $700 million. The Carroll bond is sitting in escrow at over $91 million. The properties are encumbered by liens. The banks are pulling back. The insurers are tightening. The business model is broken. The man who built his political career on the image of financial invincibility is watching the foundations of that image crack and crumble in real time, documented by court records, SEC filings, and independent financial reporting. The question is not whether the pressure is real. The question is how much of the empire will be left standing when the legal and financial processes finally reach their conclusions, and whether the political operation that depends on the image of wealth and success can survive the exposure of the financial reality underneath.